Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Rebecca Markert, Legal Director at the Freedom from Religion Foundation here in our studio in Madison, Wisconsin.
And I'm Liz Cavell, Associate Counsel at FFRF. And is it just the two of us, Rebecca?
I believe, I'm not sure, Bruce, if Joseph McDonald is also joining us. He's here, great. He is one of our newest team members who's running just a little behind today. This is what happens with live TV. He joined us as the Patrick O'Reilly Legal Fellow after graduating from the University of Wisconsin at Madison Law School this year. Hi, Joseph.
Hi, it's nice to be here.
Hello.
I asked both Liz and Joseph to join us here today to discuss a report, Religious Liberty Under Threat, the Christian Nationalist Takeover of the Federal Judiciary, released just yesterday. They both were tasked with working on the report, which discusses in alarming detail the takeover of the federal courts by radical Christian nationalist judges. If you've got questions about our topic today, you can ask them in the Facebook comments or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. So, if you've been watching our show, you know that FFRF has been active in judicial nominations for a while now. And not only for the Supreme Court, but at every level of federal courts. We've done background research on their state church history, submitted questions to the Senate Judiciary, which is tasked with vetting the nominees, and then urged our members to call their senators to vote yes or no on specific judges. So Liz, I'm going to ask the first question to you. Can you remind our viewers why this is of concern to FFRF? Why did we spend time putting together a report on judges?
Yeah, so if you know FFRF, you know that our mission is twofold. So we work to protect the separation of state and church, but we also are tasked with educating the public about issues that relate to non-theism and issues related to our legal mission. So judges and who sits on the federal bench is kind of touching on both of those missions. And so this report really kind of combines our education and our legal mission, because obviously who is on the federal bench, who's sitting in these judgeships, completely controls our legal mission. We work to keep state and church separate, which is a right of Americans under the First Amendment. And the federal courts and these judges who are sitting on these courts have complete control over what the First Amendment means. So it's vital to our legal mission that we have judges on the bench that have a understanding of the First Amendment that our founders intended, and that allows for state church separation to be healthy. And then putting together this report was kind of threading in the education element of our mission, which is we need the public to understand how judges and extreme judges' ideology is really threatening what's been our always understanding of a secular government and what our rights mean under the First Amendment. So nothing is more vital right now to a lot of issues affecting Americans, but FFRF's issues, protecting state church separation and protecting the rights of non-theists and keeping government out of religion, religion out of government. One of the biggest threats right now to all of those things is the packing of the federal judiciary with these ultra-conservative Christian nationalist ideologues. And so this is really an education mission so that people will understand how big the threat is, and so that we can sort of survey that and analyze it and talk about it and keep it in the fore.
So let's back up and do a little bit of education. I want to talk about the makeup of the federal judiciary. In case there are people watching who don't entirely understand the system, for those who don't work in federal litigation day in and day out. I want to know how the courts on the federal level are organized. Joseph, why don't you take this one?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for having me. So there are 9 Supreme Court justices, which we all know and are generally pretty comfortable with, and then the public zeitgeist. But what the public often doesn't know is that below the Supreme Court is the Federal Court of Appeals, which there are 179 appellate judges that are appointed by the President of the United States. And there are 673 judges at the district court level, which is the court of fact finding, which are again appointed by the President of the United States. Each of these judges, from district courts to the Court of Appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court, all of them are afforded a lifetime appointment. The process to which they take the bench is that the president appoints them, and that individual is then confirmed by the Senate. What we see is that where the court, or where Congress is more and more partisan, the courts become more and more partisan. The rules regarding filibusters have even changed at that period of time. In 2013, you used to require a 3/5 majority vote to end a filibuster. Democrats changed that to just have a majority, a basic majority to end that. And in 2017, a Republican congressman again extended that majority rule to end the filibusters to apply also to Supreme Court justices. So the basic rule that we're seeing is that as Congress becomes more and more partied and more divisive, so do the courts. And we see that reflected in Establishment Clause jurisprudence, as our report finds. Mm-hmm.
And we released this report just yesterday. We deliberately chose December 15th as the release date because it was the anniversary of the Bill of Rights being ratified. The date that we celebrate is the anniversary of the ratification of the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. We actually put an ad in the New York Times for Bill of Rights Day yesterday. So Joseph, why don't you explain to us why it was important for us to release this report on Bill of Rights Day?
Certainly. So Bill of Rights Day is a national recognition of the preamble to the Bill of Rights, as well as to the basic constitutional freedoms that we understand to be true, right? One of the core tenets of that is a free and independent court, right? The judiciary is part of the checks and balance system, and we need the courts to remain objective as the framers intended, so that they can then become nonpartisan. This report shows that over time, and particularly during the Trump administration, that just has not been true. And so as an example of and a return to those original tenets of the Bill of Rights, FFRF wanted to release this report on Bill of Rights Day to show that there can be a correction course to make sure that the federal courts are again independent and are a check and balance system to the policy and political parties in Congress.
So we know that the Establishment Clause has been under attack for decades. Christian nationalists have been slowly taking over the courts to turn our rights, especially our right to a free government, a government free from religion, on its head over the last few years. On your screen now is the New York Times ad that we ran, a full-page ad that shows this cartoon help roll back the clock on the judicial doomsday. And this is an alarming situation that we're experiencing, and is really going to affect our constitutional rights for decades to come. And Liz, I would like you to talk now about how judges have been interpreting the Establishment Clause, and actually how that's changed over the years, because it has changed pretty drastically.
Right. So just to go back to basics, right? When we're talking about the Establishment Clause, we are looking at the First Amendment to our Constitution. So the Establishment Clause is one part of the religion clauses in the First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And the interplay between those two clauses of the First Amendment has always kind of been at the heart of all of the litigation that FFRF has done over the meaning of the Establishment Clause and how sometimes that is being balanced against our rights under the Free Exercise Clause. So we have talked about that, the oldest metaphor in the book about the First Amendment is the wall of separation between church and state. And there's long been a lot of hostility from the religious right and the ultra-conservative movement, kind of hostility towards that metaphor, and how it's not in the Constitution verbatim that there's a wall of separation between church and state. But really that metaphor goes way back to Thomas Jefferson, who developed that metaphor to describe what the First Amendment intended to create, which was a wall of separation between religion and government. And the earliest Supreme Court decisions that analyzed what the Establishment Clause should mean. So way back in 1879, there was an early case that really adopted that wall of separation between church and state as what we should take as the authoritative meaning of what the founders intended by the Establishment Clause. And that was accepted over the early years of state church separation cases. So the Supreme Court continued to develop jurisprudence around the Establishment Clause, really using the wall of separation metaphor. Beginning in the 1980s, and not coincidentally, as the rise of the religious right as a political movement kind of came into focus, the court did start to kind of drift away from that clear separation, wall of separation between religion and government. And so we started to see sort of a slow drift that sometimes ignored the tests that the court had been following to really keep a strict separation between state and church, or to create exceptions and things like that. And that started to accelerate a lot when John Roberts became the Chief Justice. So that was in 2005. And really now that the courts are just filling up with Trump appointees and the Supreme Court makeup has changed so drastically, it's really moving at a breakneck speed. The legal inquiry has moved so far away from what the founders intended and the wall of separation idea. And this is where you see Christian nationalist ideology is really influencing the decision making, because there's this acceptance of this, so-called Christian history of America that informs these judges' decisions about what the Establishment Clause should mean, or what the founders really intended it to mean, and what they didn't intend for it to prohibit. So that kind of brings us up to now, but it hasn't been controversial. It wasn't controversial to our founders, and it wasn't controversial to the early Supreme Courts that the Establishment Clause really did mean a strict separation, a wall between church and state.
And we've really talked a lot about how the courts have moved from that strict separation that Liz mentioned to the sort of play in the joints, to actually now you cannot discriminate against churches. And also we're going to give them privileges beyond what other organizations and entities would be given. And they don't necessarily have to play by the rules. We've seen this in many cases over the last few years. As Liz mentioned, the Roberts Court has taken a number of religious liberty cases, and they have not come down in our favor. You might recall the Bladensburg Cross case out of Maryland, where they basically said that a large Christian cross in a traffic area, a traffic median in Maryland, was not a Christian symbol. And Joseph, you came to us at the height of the Espinoza decision. Why don't you remind our viewers what that decision said and why that sounded so insane to us?
Yes, so one of the main key categories of this entanglement between government and religion, particularly in schools, is with voucher programs. And so in Espinoza, the Montana Department of Revenue developed this tax credit program that would allow private individuals to write off money that they donated to this pooled fund of scholarship funds for private schools. The issue with that is that 98% of the schools in the private school pool were Catholic schools. So essentially, ostensibly, these are private individuals giving money to Catholic schools, and then the government writing off those funds, which would be a transfer of public funds to Catholic schools, which, again, historically, we have determined to be a non-neutral support of religion. Surprisingly, the Supreme Court determined that the tax plan and the tax schedule, the credit program was worded neutrally and therefore was upheld under the Constitution. It was somewhat of a rewriting and a revisionist history of the Establishment Clause as it's applied to voucher school programs. And unfortunately, we've seen the extension of that in schools since its decision.
So we've been beating this drum about what's at stake here for religious liberty cases. We decided to do this report, and we've been working on it all fall. And one of the reasons we did the report was to educate not only on the issues, but on the impact the federal bench, particularly the lower federal courts, have on our constitutional rights. Of course, during the course of our research and drafting this report, Justice Ginsburg died, and we were suddenly in the middle of a SCOTUS nomination. Liz, do you think Amy Coney Barrett's nomination process in the middle of this election helped the general public to understand the court's issue and what is exactly at stake?
Yeah, for sure. We know that, we know from polling that voters this year, more than ever in previous election years, reported that one of the issues they were voting on, what they had in mind when they were going to the ballot box, was the federal courts. And most people are thinking of Supreme Court nominations. But of course, it's not the number one issue animating most voters. And it really only got thrust into the spotlight in those last few weeks before Election Day, when so many people had already voted and cast their ballot in the presidential election. So, but I do think the nomination of the death of Justice Ginsburg, the nomination, the historically rushed and unprecedented timing of the nomination and kind of ramming through of Justice Barrett to the Supreme Court really illustrates the stakes, as clear as anything could, because of course what we had on the Supreme Court, and we know this, and most people who follow the Supreme Court even casually understand that the court has had a partisan split for a long time. And as Joseph pointed out in the beginning of the episode, the court has grown, this whole process of nominations and appointments to the courts has grown more partisan as our political institutions are growing more partisan. So we know that the court has been split 5-4 along partisan ideological lines on so many issues. But one really stark example that shows this flip on religion issues and religious privilege and how we're going to think about and analyze these religion cases is the 5-4 split coming out of public health restrictions for COVID. So the best example of this is in July of 2020, when Justice Ginsburg was still alive, there was a 5-4 split decision where the Supreme Court allowed public health restrictions on church services, among many other things, of course, in the midst of states trying to curb the deadly COVID pandemic. Two of those states, Nevada and California, were sued by churches for the restrictions on their worship services. The court 5-4 upheld those restrictions, given the circumstances around the pandemic. When that was decided, that was 5-4. Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, of course, were in dissent of that opinion. And just 4 months later, now with a new majority, after Justice Ginsburg died and Amy Coney Barrett was installed in her place, the court issued a 5-4 decision. This was just the night before Thanksgiving, the other way, just flipped on this issue, with one seat changing hands. And the only thing that's changed between now and then is that Justice Ginsburg died and Justice Barrett's in her place. And they voted 5-4, basically striking down or saying that those public health restrictions, different public health restrictions, but similarly that were restricting worship services, were a violation of the First Amendment rights, were religious discrimination against these churches that were complaining about following the pandemic restrictions or being restricted in a way that, other businesses deemed essential under the restrictions were not. So that's just as clear as you get in terms of flipping on an issue that's really important with truly life or death consequences. And the only thing that changed was who occupied that fifth seat. And so we're going to see that on many issues, including a lot of the issues around the First Amendment and religion rights.
Well, and I want to talk about that a little bit because obviously this week, Joe Biden is officially the next president. He'll be inaugurated in January. And a lot of people, I think there's a general sense that, hey, this judicial takeover is complete now. And so there's not really a whole lot to worry about anymore. But really the impact cannot be overstated. So Liz, why don't you tell us what is the impact of the Trump administration on the federal bench? And am I exaggerating at how bad it is?
No, unfortunately, I wish you were exaggerating, but it's true that the Supreme Court takeover, the 5-4 flip that I just described is complete. And there is now a 5-4, hard, ultra conservative majority on the Supreme Court, for better or for worse. And that is going to affect how issues are decided before the Supreme Court for generations. So that's the bad news. But it's only just the smallest fraction of the damage that is done in the federal courts to our constitutional rights, because of course the Supreme Court is the court of last resort in our federal system that Joseph described at the top. But there are trial level courts, our federal district courts, and then there's an intermediate appellate court. Those are the circuit courts of appeal. And they make up, as you can see just on the numbers chart, they make up the vast majority of the courts in the federal court system. And because the Supreme Court doesn't have to hear appeals, nobody, with very, very few exceptions, nobody has a right for the Supreme Court to review their case. The Supreme Court gets to pick and choose which cases they want to hear. And I think, I don't have this in front of me, Rebecca, but I think they get 7,000 to 8,000 petitions for review a year now. And they hear oral argument on maybe 70 or 80 of those, 70 or 80 out of 7,000 or 8,000. And then they issue maybe a few dozen more opinions without oral argument, but it is just the tiniest sliver of cases that request a Supreme Court appeal that get them. So in other words, the vast majority of the final decisions in the federal court system are happening at those circuit courts of appeal, and more often just at the district court level, and they don't even make it to the appellate level. So,
when you're looking at the numbers of how many judges the Trump administration got through versus some of the other presidents, what does that look like?
Right. So the impact there is just scary because Trump, in terms of his appointments, has so drastically outpaced his predecessors in president. So you're seeing this graphic now. This is first term. Of course, President Trump's term, or his term of office, is only going to be 4 years now, but he has already put 53 judges on just the circuit courts of appeals. That's that intermediate appeals court in our system. And it's obviously very, very powerful because most of the federal appeals are heard at that level. And so 53 in just 4 years compared to what you saw on the graphic, which is Obama only had 30 confirmed during his first term. Obama, in his entire 8 years, only got to appoint 55 judges to the courts of appeals, and only 30 of those in the first 4 years. G.W. Bush, 35 in his first 4 years, and only 62 in the grand total of his 8 years in office. Trump, probably by the end of the year, because of course the majority leader is still ramming through his nominees until the very last second, he'll probably get that 53 up to 54, maybe inch more. So he's doing in 4 years what most of his predecessors have done in 8 years. So it's the pace at which his nominees are getting, rammed onto the bench. And it's happening at the district court level too, not necessarily historically, although compared to Obama, he is drastically outpacing on district court appointments. So he's already made 170 in only 4 years. So it's the impact because of the pace is just massive. So I'm not sure if you have the numbers in here, but we know he's got 3 out of 9 of the justices on the Supreme Court. That's, 30% of the Supreme Court bench. But when he leaves office, a full 30% of the entire federal bench will be Trump appointees. So that is a really massive impact. And again, like Joseph said, these are judges who are going to be on the bench for life. So, and many of them are quite young. So the impact is really long lasting, and it's really not overstated.
Well, and that's another point that I'd like Joseph to talk about a little bit here, is just the profile of what these judges look like. Liz just mentioned they're young. What else do they look like?
So to be quite curt, we see a return to the American tradition of white, male, young Christian professionals. And I say professionals because while the president and senators have a baseline of qualifications that they must adhere to as set by the Constitution, there are no such baseline qualifications for these judges. There's even been an instance where the American Bar Association determined, an independent legal organization determined that some of these judges were not qualified to take the bench, and yet they were confirmed and are currently sitting at the bench. So we see a return to that. The primary issue with that monolithic profile is that you see a greater sense of disparities arising in their decision making, particularly in the issue of religious freedoms. Because they all tend to be white, male, young Christians, the idea that they're Christian nationalists is enforced in their decision making, and the rule of that is enforced as well. So you see a lot of bigotry extend through their decision making because of the profile of the court and the appointees.
It's certainly not reflective of what America actually looks like right now. Another reason we wanted to release this report was because a lot of people seem to know generally that judges are bad. And as we've mentioned before, polling suggests that people were voting with courts in mind more than they have in previous years because they know judges are bad, but they don't quite know why, what makes them so bad. you both have done significant research into these judges over the last few months, and I'd like to hear, some of the horror stories that you came across for both of you, which have been, or tell me the most outrageous thing that one of these judges has done.
Righto. So first, I just want to, there's definitely, unfortunately, plenty of fodder already there, but I do want to just touch a little bit more on what Joseph said, because a big part of why are they so bad is kind of this profile issue, which is this kind of demographic shift back to kind of the bad old days of the vast majority of these appointees are white male Christians who are professionals or who are young or who come from conservative lines of these are not public defenders and things like that. They're coming from law firms and places like that. So I mean, the demographics is really a catastrophe because it's rolling back so much progress that has been made over the past decade in terms of diversifying the federal bench, which has routinely been, or has in the past been, really sorely lacking from diversity and from reflecting the American public. So that's really, really disappointing. But to talk about, who are some of these judges and what are they doing? Why are they so bad? I mean, from the general, I mean, first we'll go from the macro. I mean, they are ultra conservative on every issue. So we're talking about FFRF's issues and how this is so bad on the First Amendment and religious liberty, but they're ultra conservative on every issue. So the profile of the Trump judge is that, they oppose immigrant justice, they oppose reproductive freedom, they are supportive of voter suppression by states and localities. They are opposing the ACA. So, I mean, they're going to be hostile to environmental regulation. All of the things that progressives care about, they're going to be ultra conservative on. But what we're focused on when we're talking about Christian nationalist political ideology is that these judges, by and large, they view Christian supremacy as consistent with U.S. history. So they view government favoritism of Christianity as A-okay with the Establishment Clause because they subscribe to this merging of American and Christian identity, and they talk about American Christian heritage as this historical fact that must be square with what the founders intended when they wrote our Constitution. And so that's a really harmful ideology when you're trying to decide what the Establishment Clause means. If you subscribe to the ideology that our founders, they obviously were okay with Christian supremacy, and that's the jumping off point of your analysis of the Establishment Clause. So that's a really big problem, and the flip side of that is that these judges are viewing religious neutrality that has always been so central to the way that the courts give life to the Establishment Clause. It's religious neutrality is really the centerpiece of American government. But it's being viewed now by the Trump judge as hostile to Christianity, which is the religious majority. And so it's just completely flipped on its head what we've always thought of as the meaning of our First Amendment, which is that government should be neutral, and that free exercise is an individual right that protects our right to have whatever religion we choose and not have it be interfered with by government, but also that we are a nation of laws. So the Christian nationalist ideology also translates to this expansive view of free exercise that really puts certain beliefs and certain religiously motivated actions above the law. That's what we're seeing in the COVID cases. So that maybe leads to, Joseph, you want to throw out an example of how that is sort of bearing fruit in some of these Trump judges' opinions?
Yeah, certainly. So to echo back to the profile issue, we see Trump appointing young professionals, and this is a major issue because they will have a lifetime appointment, which means that they can echo and chamber on the legacy of Donald Trump and the legacy of Christian nationalism for decades to come, should they continue to sit in their seats, barring any type of impeachment process. We see that with Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who came from D.C. courts. Another individual came through D.C. courts is Trevor McFadden, who directly quoted Hebrews from the Christian Bible to defend and indoctrinate the Bible when he determined that church gatherings are essentially more essential than the public health guidelines set by the district. And through that quoting, just a simple process of quoting Hebrews, he indoctrinates the Christian Bible and the American legal system, which we can clearly see is a biased, a bigoted, and problematic support of institutional, religion.
Right. And again, what he was doing in that opinion, Trevor McFadden being a Trump appointee to the U.S. District Court for D.C., which is a trial level federal district court, he was granting part of a restraining order barring the district from enforcing their COVID public health order restricting worship services, outdoor worship services in excess of 100 congregants. That's clearly a public health measure that is aimed at curbing the pandemic. Basically reaching out to Hebrews for the not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together was the passage there. The judge, Trevor McFadden, is just all too ready to grandstand for Christian privilege against these COVID restrictions because this is where the inquiry begins. And he says it's for the church, not the district or this court, to define for itself the meaning of this passage from the Bible. And there's sort of just, the whole idea of the secular law and the public health response from our secular institutions is, kind of not part of the equation. And there's unfortunately a lot of examples from the district court level because the biggest impact so far that many of these judges have gotten a chance to have on these issues have been around COVID restrictions and hearing these federal cases from churches who are filing these, restraining orders, temporary restraining orders to try and not have to follow these public health restrictions. So another just full Christian nationalist judge appointed by Trump to the district court for the Western District of Kentucky is a guy named Justin Walker. Judge Justin Walker in April of this year, same thing. He had a case where a Christian congregation wanted to gather for Easter services in violation of the statewide public health order. And he just waxed, in his opinion, granting this or exempting the church from this order. He said, on Holy Thursday, an American mayor criminalized the communal celebration of Easter. He said that it was not long ago, I'm quoting him here, it was not long ago that the government told the Supreme Court it can prohibit a church from choosing its own minister, force religious business owners to buy pharmaceuticals they consider abortion-inducing, and conscript nuns to provide birth control. So just this very, what we called the first draft of a Christian nationalist manifesto in our press release. And this is just an opinion analyzing whether or not churches, like other secular businesses and individuals should have to follow these gathering limitations to curb the deadly pandemic. And so that's at the district court level, and there are several examples more like that in our report. But we're also seeing some of the impact of these appointees at the circuit court level. So we have, I want to get into the religious displays kind of last, because that goes to SCOTUS too. But we had, let's see, a 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, that's the appellate court in the Southeast. Judges Barbara Lagoa, you might remember her name. She was on the short list for Justice Ginsburg's seat, and Britt Grant, both of them on the 11th Circuit, who were part of a majority on a panel that ruled to grant a preliminary injunction against an ordinance, basically, in other words, striking down an ordinance that bans conversion therapy of minors. So in other words, a local government wants to ban conversion therapy of minors, and these judges say that the First Amendment free exercise rights of therapists who want to do conversion therapy on minors, is more important than rises above a government's, finding of the evidence that conversion therapy harms children. And they said, quote, "People have intense moral, religious, and spiritual views about these matters. And that is exactly why the First Amendment does not allow communities to determine how their neighbors may be counseled about matters of sexual orientation." So that is just a flipping of the importance of secular law and the findings of the people who are trying to make laws and at the local level and protect the community, and elevating the rights of, usually this is conservative Christians, elevating their rights above the rights and protections of everyone else that are set by law.
And I feel that, a lot of this is bleak, and a lot of these judges are new. They've only been on the bench for a short amount of time. They really haven't gotten a lot of Establishment Clause cases on their docket yet. So that's what also makes it feel so much more dire than usual. And I know when we were putting together this report, one of the things I kept talking about when we were strategizing and trying to figure out what the report would look like is just some of the foreshadowing of what's to come. In one of the cases that I worked on here at Freedom from Religion Foundation, the city of Pensacola case, where there was a large Christian cross in a city park there, one of the judges on the 11th Circuit was a Trump judge, and he signed on to an opinion that had this radical idea that this doctrine of incorporation, which puts the Bill of Rights and applies it to the states. It says that the state government has to follow our Constitution. That incorporation idea does not apply to the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause is only something that applies to the federal government, not to the states. And this is something that we've heard before from justices. I believe Justice Thomas is one of these guys who says it's not a state issue, it's a federal thing. But now we're seeing some of these radical judges coming back and saying, actually, no, we believe this too. And so something that's been really extreme is now finding its way into majority opinions. And I really worry that a lot of these really extreme radical positions that we thought were fringe before are really going to become mainstream in a way.
Right.
Oh, go ahead.
That's right on what the threat is. I mean, that's another way of saying kind of the parallel to what Joseph was saying, which is it's now, that conservative ideology has gotten so much more just ultra radical on some of these small kind of issues of interpretation, like what you're talking about, the incorporation doctrine, and on down the line. I mean, every aspect of this. These sort of fringe interpretations are now becoming the mainstream. And another way of saying that is the people that are getting nominated to fill these seats are more like Justice Thomas, ultra extreme views, and less like some sort of moderate version of a judge. It's just becoming so ultra partisan to, and the ideology of the people that are being appointed by Trump is just is from the fringe. It's from the fringe of the political ideology. And yeah, you're seeing these judges kind of giving more than lip service, kind of saying, hey, I kind of agree with Justice Thomas that the Establishment Clause doesn't even apply to the states. In other words, all the Establishment Clause means is that the federal government cannot establish a national religion. But otherwise, the Constitution doesn't care about that. I mean, that is a fringe view. And the fact that circuit court judges feel kind of like they should kind of telegraph their interpretation of that is scary, but it's exactly what the threat is.
Right. And so what can be done? What can we do looking at what is the threat? Is there anything to be done? I mean, Joseph, you just graduated from law school. Do you have any answers for us?
I don't know if I have any answers necessarily, but I do think that there is an interesting case study in it, and that it's in one of the judges that Liz brought up earlier, Judge McFadden. So Judge Trevor McFadden was appointed at the young age of 37. He had gone to the University of Virginia Law School. He had clerked under Justice Kennedy. He went to the private sector before going back to teach. While he was teaching at UVA, he also wrote this piece that determined, or that set the position that the FBI should not be an independent investigatory source in the government, particularly in looking at the Comey investigation. He determined that it should be an agency under strict presidential guidance. So if the president wanted to fire, terminate, suspend any employee within the agency, he could, and he could also shut down any investigation that he wanted. As we see him building that breadth of evidence at the young age of 37, it's no wonder that President Trump would cherry pick and pluck him out of this huge, vast field of qualified candidates to appoint him, even where the ABA determined that he was not a qualified judge, right? An actual legal authority, an independent investigatory source determined that he was not a qualified candidate. So what can we do with that? If we can't offer reform in the broadest, most progressive sense of it and get qualified candidates in there, if we're going to operate under the rules that we have now, the least that we can do as progressives is build a breadth of evidence so that young judges can put forth the ideals that align with separation of church and state. Building a breadth of evidence in the academy, building a breadth of evidence and policy setting, really developing a basis of evidence similar to the work that FFRF does with developing these policy pieces and developing these reports, so that, hey, maybe one day, someone from FFRF becomes an appointee and sets forth these agendas as counter to President Trump's appointees.
Right. And Rebecca, you're right that, this is the sobering part. We are only, these appointees that we're talking about in the report and these numbers that we've been kind of flashing on the screen and talking about, and this crazy breakneck pace of appointments. These people are sitting judges now for life. So you're right that damage is done. And we're only seeing right now the early stages of the radical changes that their rulings are going to bring about, especially for our purposes, to how religious liberty is defined in America. I mean, what we're going to be seeing as, Trump appointees continue to decide these cases, is this perversion of religious liberty, these the idea that free exercise rights can be used or should be used to undermine the laws that protect us all from discrimination or keep the rest of us safe. We're going to continue to see courts, not holding dear the idea of religious neutrality by government. So just giving their thumbs up to government favoritism of religion, and probably Christianity in particular, and just waving it away as part of the Christian heritage of America, which is false, but is a powerful ideology. And so we are only seeing the beginning of some of the damage. But I think in terms of, well, what can be done other than sit back and, watch the whole world explode? We've heard a lot about court reform, and just the fact that people understand that court reform is an issue, a political issue, a policy issue that matters, I think is really important, because there's a lot that can be done in the policy space there. That's not just about, tit for tat. I mean, there should be more judges. There should be more, the constitutional parameters are pretty narrow. I mean, the Constitution sets out the structure of the courts, but Congress has the power to, put a lot of things in place that keep the courts from devolving into just the partisan and ultra conservative rubber stamp factory that it is becoming. So, I mean, there is possibility there. And so what does that mean? That means that we as voters and we as people who educate voters, we need to continue pushing people to understand this as a voting issue. It's really important when you're voting for especially your senators and your president, but also your senators. They are the people who put these judges in their seats. So you, have the power to call your senators and tell them what you think about judges and how they should vote, how they should consent on judges, and what are the things that you as a constituent are okay with and not okay with in terms of how the Senate fills that role. And when you're voting for senators, it's important to know how they view this process and what they would look for in a judge in approving a judicial nominee. So educating voters, voting on these issues, those are all really important. And those are things that can be done. And that's part of also the education mission, which is everyone in the public, the citizenry, just in general, needs to be this whole federal court process and how it affects all of our constitutional rights is really suffers from kind of living in the shadows. Everybody hears about these big Supreme Court cases, but what people don't hear about are all the little decisions that these district court judges are making, like the ones me and Joseph just described, were just these sort of low profile cases, but they are building this canon of federal case law that affects you and me and how protected we are by secular laws and how protected LGBTQ people are from anti-discrimination laws. And, how protected religious minorities are in communities that want to favor religion or endorse religion. And so education is a big part, I think, of what we can do that's empowering and that has an effect, because we will see when we poll on this issue, more and more people voting and thinking about the courts and knowing about these judges and these nominees and who these people are. I mean, it is shocking, unfortunately, to read our report and learn about the profile and some of the examples of the judges that are now sitting on our federal bench deciding our rights for the rest of their lives.
And obviously, we could talk about this for a very long time, and we have been talking about it for a very long time. And so we want to get to questions right now. Liz actually has access to the questions this week. So Liz, why don't you tell us what people are asking about?
Oh, yes. I'm so sorry. Give me a minute real quick. Say something else, throw something up. I'm
Well,
looking for the
I think-
questions document.
I think the most important piece of advice that I would give to anybody who's watching who is really feeling helpless and trying to figure out what can I do right now to stem this is really call your senators and figure out what they look for in a judge. Tell them what you look for in a judge, and really ask what their process is for them to give their advice and consent. We do have a new Congress coming in. We have a new president coming in. So now is the time to really figure out where your representatives are at on court reform, on judges, on judicial nominations, and the like.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was top-notch filler, and I found the questions. And well, they're just now being added to the script. So I'm gonna jump in. This is from our own co-president, Dan Barker, who is always supporting us by watching our Asking Atheists. But this is actually an interesting question, and so I'm going to put it out there. Does Trump really get credit for these appointments, or has he simply subcontracted out to the Federalist Society? Discuss. That kind of raises a really good point, which is kind of the whole point undergirding the report somewhat. I mean, when we say Trump appointees, yes, Trump is appointing these justices, but it is so true that he has been used really by Christian nationalists to install all of their preferred people onto the federal bench. And so that's kind of the scary thing about it, is that it's no longer become this process that's guided by, some sort of presidential decision-making process. It really is special interests giving a list to the president and the president appointing judges from the list. That obviously is not good and not the way that it's meant to be.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that they did celebrate his election 4 years ago because they had this opportunity. He was sort of the useful idiot for them in getting these judges through. And I really think that Mitch McConnell gets a lot of credit, so to speak, for what has happened in the last 4 years to the federal bench. He has been the one driving this ship, making sure that in the last few months, instead of providing COVID relief to families who desperately need it, that they've been ramming through judges during this lame duck session. So really, it isn't just Trump, it is also the Senate, and particularly Mitch McConnell, and some of these other legal Christian right groups who have been waiting for these types of opportunities to ram through the judges.
That's right.
Let's not forget. Oh, go ahead, Liz.
You got it, Joseph. Go.
President Trump has also been under investigation and accused of selling some of the judgeship seats, particularly towards the end of his post-election period. And we find that that's something that, Rod Blagojevich did and was indicted on after Barack Obama vacated his Senate seat when he took office. It seems that President Trump is trying to do something similar, only he has pardon power. So we'll see how he tries and attempts to use that pardon power towards the end of this presidency.
Right. And I mean, what I was going to say is kind of in the vein of like, what Joseph's talking about is that this whole process is becoming corrupted and more and more partisan, but it really is just like special interests should not have a say in who is getting lifetime appointments to the federal bench. One of the pages in the report that we're talking about today is a picture, and Bruce will kill me because we don't have this graphic, but it's really cool, and I'm going to bring it up. It's a picture that the USA Today printed. Well, it's not from the USA Today. Oh, God. It's a picture of the Barrett nomination ceremony, which became, famous for being a COVID super spreader event. But one of the things that was done in the media was kind of identifying all the people who were present at Barrett's nomination ceremony. in the Rose Garden. And one of the kind of inadvertent things that revealed to us at FFRF was how many people from radical religious right legal organizations, pastors from mega churches, political pastors like spiritual advisors to the president and those sort of pastors of influence, all these just ultra radical right Christian figures that were there in person in the Rose Garden to celebrate the elevation of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. And of course, why are they celebrating? They're celebrating because they know that she will reflect their interests in the cases she decides. And many of those people included the heads of some of these ultra radical, Christian legal organizations that we find ourselves sometimes on the opposite side of in litigation. And that includes Alliance Defending Freedom, the First Liberty Institute, these guys that are taking the cases to eviscerate anti-discrimination laws because, conservative Christian bakers and wedding photographers and wedding venues and all these conservative Christian business owners do not want to serve LGBTQ customers on the same terms as their straight counterparts. So, I mean, these are the people who are celebrating. These are the people who are driving these appointments and then celebrating these appointments. And of course, there's a reason that tells you a lot by who's celebrating. So I'm going to move on to another question. Okay. So I'll put this out there, Rebecca, even though we talked about it earlier as maybe something a little off topic. Howie asks, is FFRF doing anything about Joel Osteen's megachurch getting $4.4 million in COVID stimulus money? And so just without getting super specific, because I don't think any of us are versed on this, but Andrew Seidel, who we all work with at FFRF, did do an op-ed about this today. You can find it on Religion Dispatches if you really care. But FFRF did do a lot of work when the PPP program was first being administered early in the year, and we made all these points in a comment to the Small Business Administration because there were obviously a lot of loopholes in the PPP program. And now we know apparently that Joel Osteen's church got over $4 million in these funds. And of course, he is the pastor of Lakewood Church, which is, I think, the biggest church in the US. And he is just an ultra rich, disgusting mega preacher with, the private jet and all the things. But again, we know that like a lot of big corporations, big mega churches have been able to take advantage of taxpayer money, which, as Joseph talked about earlier with voucher programs, should be a really strict constitutional line based on our Establishment Clause. I think our founders understood and intended for public money not to go to religious organizations and particularly churches. And so this is just one of the many ways in which, with our case law and judges moving the goalposts on what the Establishment Clause prohibits, back and back and back, there's a ton of room for abuse and taxpayer money going to mega churches and other, religious organizations and religious uses. And people would be surprised.
And when the PPP first came out, we did sound the alarm that if religious organizations, and particularly churches, were to be included, that it was going to be ripe for abuse. And so really, this is just that coming true. One of the reasons we are not as well versed about this this week is because it is just breaking news. I think it came out yesterday, and I personally was off. I'm doing an extended family leave for childcare reasons, but it was also my son's 5th birthday yesterday. So I saw it late last night on Twitter, saw Andrew was on top of it. It's new, and we will be looking further into it and many other abuses that are obviously going to be coming to light with this program.
Right. And just to we're getting a little in the weeds, but it's hard to resist, which is why is it ripe for abuse when you give public money to churches? Well, one of the reasons is that churches and religious organizations do not have to follow by the same financial transparency rules as the rest of us 501c3 nonprofit organizations. They don't have to file tax forms. They don't have to in any way account for any of the money that they save by being tax exempt. In other words, they're not accountable to the taxpayers, but they get taxpayer money. And so they can be, and often are, especially big organizations like Joel Osteen's, huge financial black holes. And there's all kinds of financial abuse, obviously, where there's not financial transparency. I think that's basic. So yet another reason why public money going to churches is bad. But I digress. So this is one final comment from Alita Ledenbecker, who is a chapter leader. Hello, Alita. This is not a question, but a comment, as they say, and our kids' virtual kindergarten class. While stacking the courts against the separation of church and state is terrible, this broader implication for all of these issues is staggering. I think what Alita is getting at is our issues really, really suffering, and it's really disheartening how many other issues are affected. It's not just what our report focuses on, which is how Christian nationalist ideology is really going to just eviscerate or just turn on its head the idea of religious liberty. It's all these other issues that affect people so much. And it's really staggering. Mm-hmm. But I don't want to end on that sobering note.
So that concludes Ask an Atheist for this week. Thank you for joining us. This week on FFRF's broadcast program, Free Thought Matters, let me just figure out. We will be celebrating the winter solstice with a festival of free-thinking music from some of our favorite musicians, including Roy Zimmerman, Shelley Segal, Addison Fry, and Tahira Clayton, and our own Dan Barker, and more. You can see Free Thought Matters this Sunday on TV stations across the U.S., or check it out on our YouTube and Facebook feeds. And next week on the show, we will be interviewing free-thinking Nebraska legislator, Megan Hunt. That's right here next week at noon Wednesday on Facebook Live. And if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, please go to our website at ffrf.org. We'll be back next Wednesday at noon Central Time.